The stage was set for what would become one of the most talked about interviews in recent memory. The studio, bathed in golden lighting, had an air of calculated precision, with cameras positioned to capture every flicker of expression, every pause, and every shift in body language. Millions of viewers across the country tuned in, eager to witness the highly anticipated conversation between Barron Trump and Catherine Blake, a journalist known for her razor-sharp intellect and relentless interview style. Blake had built a reputation for dismantling her guests, exposing their weaknesses, and pushing them into rhetorical corners they couldn't escape. Tonight, she had set her sights on Barron Trump, a young man who had spent his life in the public eye but had never truly stepped forward into the political fray. Dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, Barron sat with an air of quiet confidence, his demeanor unshaken despite the gravity of the moment. Unlike many seasoned politicians who had taken this very seat before him, Barron was an unknown entity in the world of high-stakes debate. He had been discussed in the media, scrutinized from afar, but never had he been given a platform to define himself on his own terms. That was about to change. Catherine Blake, seated across from him, exhaled slowly, already strategizing her approach. She wasn't here for small talk, she was here to challenge, to press, to provoke. The audience in the studio leaned forward as the show's opening music faded into silence. The air was thick with anticipation. The cameras zoomed in. The nation was watching. And for the first time, Barron Trump was about to speak for himself. As the final notes of the show's opening theme faded into silence, Catherine Blake leaned forward slightly, her piercing gaze locking onto Barron Trump. She was a veteran journalist, a master at setting the tone early, and she wasted no time doing just that. Her reputation was built on breaking down even the most polished of politicians, on peeling away carefully crafted facades until there was nowhere left to hide. Tonight, she intended to do the same. "Barron," she began, her voice smooth but edged with just the right amount of challenge. "This is an interview people have been waiting for." Unfazed, Barron gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Is that so?" he replied, his tone even, devoid of nervous energy. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't defensive. He was measured, controlled. Catherine recognized the response for what it was, a subtle but effective move to shift the power dynamic. He wasn't allowing her to dictate the tempo. She adjusted her strategy accordingly. "You're a name people recognize, yet few actually know you," she continued. "That changes tonight." The audience tensed, feeling the weight of the moment. This was the first real exchange, the opening gambit in what promised to be a battle of intellect and composure. Catherine had seen countless guests falter at this stage, caught between the need to be likable and the fear of saying too much. Barron, however, remained undeterred. "Silence isn't always absence," he responded, his voice calm but deliberate. "Sometimes, it's preparation." A murmur rippled through the audience. It was a strikingly self-assured answer, one that sidestepped the trap without feeling evasive. Rather than scrambling to justify his past silence, he reframed it as a strength, as an intentional choice rather than an omission. Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly. She had anticipated a defensive response, maybe even an admission of hesitation, but Barron wasn't playing that game. He wasn't just answering questions, he was controlling the conversation. "All right," she said, shifting gears. "You've been in the public eye your entire life, whether you wanted it or not. Do you ever feel like people have already decided who you are, regardless of what you say tonight?" Barron took his time before responding, allowing a few seconds of silence to pass. It was a move of someone who understood the weight of the moment, someone who commanded attention without demanding it. "Perception is an interesting thing," he finally said. "It tells you more about the people observing than the person being observed." Catherine blinked, taking in the response. This was going to be more interesting than she had expected. Catherine Blake was no stranger to difficult conversations. She had spent years cornering politicians, business moguls, and cultural figures, forcing them to confront the toughest questions about their lives, careers, and the privileges they carried. But tonight, she was facing someone different, Barron Trump, a young man who had lived his entire life under scrutiny yet had rarely spoken for himself. If there was any moment to challenge him on the weight of his last name and the privileges it carried, it was now. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the desk. "Let's talk about the weight of your name," she said, her voice deceptively casual. "Your last name is one of the most polarizing in modern history. It carries power, controversy, and expectation. Whether you like it or not, it has shaped how people see you. But my question is, has it shaped how you see yourself?" It was a calculated question, a trap carefully laid. If Barron admitted that his last name defined him, he risked confirming the public's assumptions, that he was simply a product of his father's legacy, living in the shadow of a controversial figure. But if he denied it outright, he might come across as naive, detached from the reality of his own privilege. Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. He didn't rush to answer, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make the moment feel deliberate rather than hesitant. Then, with an unwavering gaze, he spoke. "Everyone is shaped by where they come from," he said, his voice steady. "But the difference between being shaped and being defined is a matter of choice." A murmur ran through the audience. It was a thoughtful answer, carefully crafted yet undeniably authentic. He wasn't rejecting the idea that his family's legacy had influenced him, he was reframing the conversation to emphasize personal agency. Catherine recognized the strategic brilliance of the response, but she wasn't going to let him off that easily. She pivoted quickly. "You speak of choice," she pressed, her tone sharpening just slightly. "But how much choice have you really had? You were born into wealth, power, influence. You didn't have to fight for a place at the table, you inherited it. Would you say that's privilege, or do you reject that label?" The room fell silent. It was the kind of question that could easily unravel even the most prepared guest. A simple "yes" would alienate those who resented privilege, a simple "no" would make him seem oblivious to the advantages he had been given. Barron allowed a brief, almost imperceptible smile to cross his lips before answering. "Privilege is an interesting word," he mused. "If a doctor's child grows up with access to the best education, is that privilege? If a musician's son grows up surrounded by music, is that privilege? Or is privilege just another way of saying that some people start their journey differently?" Catherine's fingers twitched against the desk. He was doing it again, reframing the question, shifting the narrative so that he wasn't playing defense but instead leading the conversation. She knew she had to push harder. "So you acknowledge it, then," she said, trying to pin him down. Barron nodded slightly. "I acknowledge that no one chooses where they start," he said. "Only where they go from there." The audience reacted immediately. Some nodded in quiet approval, others exchanged glances, processing the weight of his words. Catherine knew she had a formidable guest in front of her. He wasn't just dodging tough questions, he was turning them into opportunities to define himself. She had seen many politicians and public figures stumble over discussions of privilege, struggling to find the right balance between humility and authenticity. But Barron Trump was handling it differently. He wasn't apologizing, he wasn't deflecting, he was engaging with the question in a way that made people think. Catherine adjusted her posture, realizing that this interview wasn't going to follow the predictable pattern she had anticipated. This wasn't just another guest being grilled. This was a conversation, and Barron Trump was proving that he wasn't here to be defined by anyone but himself. Catherine Blake had interviewed some of the most powerful figures in modern politics, and she had developed an instinct for sensing when a guest was avoiding a question. But Barron Trump wasn't just avoiding traps, he was redirecting them, reshaping the entire conversation in a way that made him look less like a defensive interviewee and more like someone in control. That made him dangerous. And interesting. She decided it was time to cut through the philosophical answers and get to the heart of the matter. "Let's talk about something you can't reframe," she said, her voice measured but firm. "Unlike the rest of your family, you've stayed out of the media's direct line of fire for most of your life. Until now." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Tell me, Barron, why step into it now?" It was a direct challenge. It implied that this wasn't just an interview, it was an entrance onto the political stage. And for someone carrying the last name Trump, that wasn't a small step. Barron took his time before answering. His demeanor was, as always, composed, but there was a shift, subtle, but noticeable. He leaned forward slightly, just enough to signal engagement, not aggression. "Because silence isn't always the best response," he said. "Sometimes, people don't just need to hear stories, they need to hear them from the right voices." The answer was deceptively simple, but Catherine caught the deeper implication. He wasn't just here to respond to criticism or clear up misconceptions, he was here to define the conversation itself. He was asserting that he had something worth saying, something that couldn't be left for others to interpret. Catherine narrowed her gaze, recognizing that she needed to up the pressure. "So you believe you're the right voice?" she pressed. Barron didn't miss a beat. "I believe people deserve to decide that for themselves." The audience shifted. Some leaned in, intrigued. Others whispered among themselves. He wasn't making any grand declarations, but he was planting the idea in people's minds that he could be something more than just the son of a former president. Catherine saw the opening and seized it. "All right," she said, adjusting her tone. "Let's take your name out of the equation. Imagine you weren't a Trump, no legacy, no recognition. Do you think people would still be listening to you right now?" For the first time that night, Barron exhaled just a little deeper, as if acknowledging the weight of the question. But his response was quick and sharp. "People listen to me because of my name," he admitted. "But if I had nothing worth saying, would they still be listening now?" The audience reacted immediately. Applause, murmurs, the unmistakable ripple of a moment that resonated beyond the walls of the studio. It was a masterful counterattack, not a rejection of his privilege, but a challenge to those who assumed that privilege alone was enough to command attention. Catherine pressed her lips together, suppressing a flicker of irritation. She had spent years controlling interviews, dictating narratives, but Barron Trump wasn't just answering questions, he was leading the conversation. She shifted tactics. "Let's cut through all of this," she said, her tone growing sharper. "Are you stepping into politics for the first time tonight?" For the first time, Barron hesitated, not long, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough for Catherine to catch it. Then, he smiled. "I won't enter politics just because my last name is Trump," he said. "But I also won't avoid it just because people think I shouldn't." The studio fell into silence. It was an answer that wasn't a confirmation, nor was it a denial. It was something more deliberate, a statement of intent without full commitment. It was a message that left room for speculation, for conversation, for headlines. Catherine knew what had just happened. He hadn't just answered her question, he had taken control of how people would talk about it. She could already see the headlines forming: "Barron Trump leaves the door open for a political future." She took a slow breath and exhaled. She still had time for one final move, one last attempt to push him into a corner. She leaned in, her voice dropping slightly, filled with quiet intensity. "If one day America asked you to lead, would you say yes?" The air in the studio felt heavier than before. The audience collectively held its breath. The camera zoomed in, capturing the flicker of thought in Barron Trump's piercing blue eyes. He didn't rush to answer, didn't let the question dictate his pace. Finally, he exhaled and leaned forward slightly. "The real question," he said, his voice smooth but deliberate, "is not whether I would say yes. The real question is whether America is ready for a different kind of leader." The reaction was electric. The audience erupted, not in shock, but in something more powerful. Recognition. Discussion. A shift in perception. Catherine sat back, studying him. She had tried to pin him down, force a commitment, but he had done something far more strategic. He had left the public to answer the question for him. She realized, in that moment, that Barron Trump wasn't just participating in the conversation. He was shaping it. And whether or not he ever officially entered politics, one thing was clear: America was already listening. Catherine Blake had spent years perfecting the art of the political interview. She had gone head-to-head with presidents, senators, CEOs, figures who had spent decades mastering the dance of public relations. She knew how to dismantle them, how to push them into a corner, how to make them reveal something they never intended to. But tonight, with Barron Trump, something was different. He wasn't just dodging her traps, he was turning them against her. Sensing that he had successfully deflected every previous attempt to corner him, Catherine decided to go for the most loaded question of the night. It was time to test his loyalty, his moral compass, and his ability to handle controversy. She leaned in, lowering her voice slightly, making the moment feel heavier. "Your father," she began, pausing for emphasis, "has been one of the most controversial leaders in recent history. Some revere him. Others believe he was the most divisive figure of our time." The room fell into complete silence. Everyone knew where this was going. Catherine let the moment stretch, ensuring the weight of her words settled before delivering the real punch. "Tell me, Barron," she said, her eyes locked onto his, "have you ever, even for a moment, been ashamed of something he has said or done?" There it was. The question that could make or break the interview. A yes would be seen as a betrayal of his father's legacy. A no would cast him as blindly loyal, unwilling to acknowledge flaws. Either way, the answer would be dissected, scrutinized, turned into headlines within minutes. The audience held their breath. Even Catherine, for all her experience, felt the electricity in the room. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she could finally force Barron Trump into an uncomfortable position. But Barron didn't flinch. He didn't shift in his seat. He didn't exhale sharply, as so many had done before him. Instead, he remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. And then, in the most unexpected twist of the night, he did something no one saw coming. He asked her a question. "Have you ever been ashamed of something President Biden has said or done?" The reaction was immediate. Gasps. A few scattered laughs. A sharp murmur spread through the audience like an electric current. Catherine blinked, caught off guard. In all her years of journalism, she had prepared for every kind of response: anger, denial, even awkward justification. But she had not prepared for this. She quickly regained her composure, her voice controlled. "This isn't about me, Barron," she countered, trying to regain control. Barron's gaze didn't waver. "Isn't it?" he asked, his tone calm, deliberate. "You're a journalist. Your job is to challenge assumptions, to make the public think. So tell me, why is it a fair question to ask if I'm ashamed of my father, but if I ask you the same about President Biden, it suddenly isn't?" The audience erupted. Some clapped, others exchanged stunned glances. Even those who weren't Barron supporters had to admit, it was a masterful move. Catherine inhaled deeply, realizing that for the first time that night, she wasn't the one in control. She had spent the entire interview trying to corner him, yet somehow, he had flipped the dynamic. Now, she was the one on the defensive. But she wasn't done yet. She still had a job to do. "All right," she said, adjusting her approach. "Let's bring this back to you." The audience settled. Barron remained poised, unfazed. "You've spent this interview proving that you can handle pressure, that you can hold your own," Catherine said. "But let's cut through all of that. At the end of the day, do you truly know who you are? Or are you just a product of media perception?" It was a dangerous question, one that could shake even the most confident public figures. But Barron's response was immediate. "If I were just a name," he said, his voice calm and steady, "then why am I sitting here answering these questions myself?" The audience erupted for the final time that night. It wasn't shock. It wasn't controversy. It was something deeper, recognition. Even Catherine, despite everything, felt the weight of what had just happened. She had set the stage for an interrogation, but instead, Barron Trump had turned it into a declaration. And for the first time all night, she realized, she wasn't the one in control anymore. He was. The studio was no longer just a stage. It was a battlefield. And the dust was finally settling. But the outcome was clear to everyone watching, whether in the audience or through their screens at home. Barron Trump had not merely survived this interview. He had owned it. As the studio's bright lights illuminated the scene, the energy in the room shifted. What had begun as an interview meant to scrutinize and challenge Barron Trump had evolved into something far more significant. Catherine Blake had spent her career setting the stage for tough, unrelenting conversations, but tonight, she wasn't just facing a guest, she was facing a strategist. Barron had not just endured the pressure, he had embraced it, using every moment to shape his own narrative. He wasn't merely answering questions, he was leading the conversation. The audience could feel it, and so could Catherine. But she had one final move left, one last attempt to regain control of the moment. She exhaled slowly, leaning in just slightly. Her voice dropped to a quieter, more reflective tone. "Since we're talking about standing in your own light," she said, measuring her words carefully, "let's address the other question on everyone's mind." The room fell into a hush. Barron's expression remained unchanged, but the intensity in his eyes sharpened. He was listening. He was waiting. Catherine did not hesitate. "Your father has been one of the most controversial leaders in modern history," she began. "Some people revere him. Others see him as divisive. You've spent this interview defining yourself, separating yourself from his legacy in your own way. But let's be honest, no matter what you say, no matter how much you try to stand on your own, people will always see you as Donald Trump's son first." She let the words settle, then delivered her final challenge. "Do you think you can ever truly escape that shadow?" It was a calculated strike, designed to pierce through Barron's composure. If there was a moment when he would crack, when the weight of expectation, pressure, and scrutiny would finally push him into an uncomfortable admission, this was it. The audience leaned forward. The air in the studio was thick with anticipation. But Barron didn't react with frustration. He didn't waver. Instead, he did what he had done all night, he took control of the moment. He leaned back ever so slightly, his expression composed, his presence unwavering. And then, with a calm and deliberate voice, he answered. "I don't need to escape a shadow," he said. "I just need to stand in my own light." The room erupted. Applause. Gasps. A few audience members even stood, exchanging knowing glances as if they had just witnessed something bigger than a political interview. They had witnessed a turning point. Catherine, for the first time that evening, allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of triumph, but of recognition. She had spent years breaking down political figures, unraveling their carefully crafted personas. But tonight, she hadn't been speaking to someone hiding behind a persona. Tonight, she had been speaking to someone who knew exactly who he was. But she still had one last card to play. As the applause began to settle, she leaned forward once more, her tone quieter, more piercing than before. This time, she wasn't just a journalist looking for a headline, she was someone who understood the gravity of the moment. "All right, Barron," she said. "Let's strip away the politics. Let's strip away the legacy, the scrutiny, the expectations." Barron didn't move. Didn't flinch. He just watched her, waiting. Catherine let the moment stretch, ensuring that when she finally asked the question, it would land with full force. "Who are you, Barron?" The studio fell completely silent. This wasn't just a question, it was the question. The kind of question that every person, no matter their name, no matter their status, had to answer at some point in their life. She had saved it for last, knowing that after an entire interview filled with counterattacks, deflections, and rhetorical precision, this was the one question that couldn't be sidestepped. Barron held her gaze for a long moment. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Then, finally, he spoke. "I am someone who refuses to be defined by anyone but myself." The audience erupted. Not in shock. Not in controversy. But in recognition. Because in that moment, Barron Trump had done what no one expected. He had walked into an arena built to break him and had walked out of it unshaken. Catherine let the applause carry on before finally nodding, her voice steady but filled with a newfound understanding. "Well, Barron," she said, glancing at the audience before turning back to him, "I think we can all agree on one thing tonight." The crowd quieted, waiting for her conclusion. "You're not just another political figure's son." The words hung in the air, charged with meaning. Barron gave a slow nod. A quiet, knowing acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said simply. And with that, the interview was over. The fallout, a shift in the political landscape. The moment the cameras stopped rolling, the energy in the room changed. It wasn't just another political interview. It wasn't just another staged debate. It was something bigger. Because tonight, Barron Trump hadn't just survived the scrutiny, he had changed the conversation entirely. By the time he stepped off the stage, social media had already exploded. Barron Trump just changed everything. Not a boy in his father's shadow, his own man. That wasn't an interview, that was history in the making. In living rooms across the country, people weren't just watching a young man defend himself against the media. They were watching a transformation. Catherine sat in her chair for a moment longer, watching Barron leave, her mind replaying every moment of the past hour. She had gone into this expecting to dismantle him. Instead, she had helped reveal him. And whether she liked it or not, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Because Barron Trump wasn't just answering questions tonight, he was reshaping the political conversation in America. And the most important part? America was listening. As the interview came to a close, the energy in the studio didn't dissipate, it lingered, heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. The audience, some still standing, others whispering in hushed tones, recognized that they had just witnessed something significant. This wasn't just another high-profile interview. It wasn't just another attempt to dissect the legacy of the Trump name. This was a shift in perception. Barron Trump had not only held his ground against one of the toughest interviewers in the industry, he had controlled the entire narrative from start to finish. He had turned every loaded question into an opportunity to define himself. And when the moment demanded it, he had taken command of the conversation in a way that few seasoned politicians could. Catherine Blake, still seated at her desk, exhaled deeply as the applause began to fade. She had come into this expecting to push Barron Trump, to force him into a corner, to make him reveal a version of himself that the public had never seen. And she had succeeded. But not in the way she had anticipated. Because instead of unraveling, he had revealed himself on his own terms. As Barron stood up from his chair, the camera caught one last glimpse of him, his posture unshaken, his expression composed, his presence undeniable. This wasn't the image of a reluctant son stepping into the public eye out of obligation. This was someone who knew exactly who he was and where he was going. The social media explosion. By the time Barron exited the studio, social media had already erupted. Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook were flooded with reactions. Small Blue Diamond, that wasn't just an interview, that was a masterclass in composure. Small Blue Diamond, Barron Trump just walked into an ambush and walked out unscathed. Small Blue Diamond, say what you will about his last name, this young man just proved he's his own person. Small blue diamond, for the first time, I actually want to hear more from Barron Trump. Political analysts and media commentators scrambled to keep up. Was this a sign of something bigger? Had America just witnessed the rise of a new political voice? One thing was clear, Barron Trump was no longer just a name associated with his father, he was now a figure people were talking about in his own right. The legacy shift. Catherine sat back, watching the camera crews begin to pack up. She had done thousands of interviews, but this one felt different. She had expected to leave the studio as the one in control, as the interviewer who had tested Barron Trump's resolve. Instead, she had helped launch a conversation that would extend far beyond this single night. Barron Trump had walked onto that stage as a young man in the shadow of a political giant. But he had walked off it as something else entirely. A force. A thinker. Maybe even something more. And whether people supported him or not, one truth was undeniable. America was watching. And America was listening. Barron Trump's interview wasn't just a media spectacle, it was a masterclass in composure, strategy, and self-definition. It offered valuable lessons for anyone navigating public perception, leadership, or even personal identity. First, control the narrative. Barron didn't just react to tough questions, he redirected them. Instead of being pushed into defensive positions, he turned the conversation in his favor, proving that true leadership isn't about avoiding pressure but about shaping the discussion. Second, confidence without arrogance is powerful. Throughout the interview, Barron remained calm, collected, and articulate. He didn't raise his voice, over-explain, or become defensive. He simply let his words, measured and intentional, speak for themselves. Third, legacy doesn't define you, your choices do. Barron acknowledged his family name but refused to let it dictate his identity. His responses reflected a deep understanding that while you can't choose where you come from, you can choose how you carry that weight. Finally, the ability to think critically and challenge assumptions is essential. His counter-question about President Biden flipped the script, showing the power of asking the right questions rather than just giving the right answers. In a world driven by narratives, Barron Trump proved that the strongest voice is the one that defines itself.